alienation. Now that's the third subunit. Now in alienation, let's look at the questions. What kind of questions do we have? Critically assess the Marxian theory of alienation 2020, 10 marker. According to Marx, how are human beings alienated from their human potential, and what does he suggest to change this? Identify the similarities and differences between Marx's theory of alienation and Durkheim's theory of anomie. So this also happens in theory papers, that they just draw, they in one question, they will ask you to refer to two thinkers, right? This happens off and on. According to Marx, capitalism transforms even the personal relationship between men and women, critically examined with illustrations from contemporary Indian context. So there is now, you can see that there is a lot of emphasis on alienation. Let's just quickly look at what all we have here. So the first pointer is, in order, whenever you're writing on alienation, you just cannot afford to miss out on this. What is the important point? The point is, the first is source. Where exactly did Marx write about it? So it is EPM, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. In this particular work, so for the first time, Marx discussed alienation in Economic and Philosophic, not philosophical, philosophic manuscripts of 1844. This book is also called the Paris manuscripts, right? Because Marx wrote it when he was in Paris in exile. Now, Marx, then another thing, when he talks about alienation, he wants to refer to a situation wherein the relation between labor and human nature. So we are talking about relation between labor and human nature gets distorted, it gets perverted, it gets corrupted. So the relation between human nature, labor and human nature was perfect all along. But because of these exploitative relations of production, what happens is that this gets completely perverted by capitalism. So alienation informs us about the peculiar form that our relation with our own labor, our relation to our own labor takes under capitalism. So keep these pointers in mind. These will make for a fantastic introduction. And why does this happen? Well, because labor is not used in accordance to my will, because it's the capitalist who has bought my labor. Labor is now used as per the whim and fancy of the capitalist. So basically, labor is used in accord. So our labor is in accordance with the purpose of the capitalist, right? Who hires us, who pays us, etc. So basically, our labor is not an expression of us, right? Our labor is an expression of the will, the whim, the fancy, the purpose, the intent of the capitalist. So this is something, so this is how Marx would say, the worker gets alienated from their own labor. And as the worker gets alienated from their own labor, the worker also gets alienated from their own true human nature. Now, some of the important aspects, so some of the things that are there, labor is external to the worker. So basically, it does not belong to his essential being. As the worker is working, the labor is not really part of his self. It is external to the worker. This is why in his work, he does not affirm himself, but he denies himself. So, denial. Labor as, or you can just write labor as denial and not affirmation. Labor as denial and not affirmation. So this is something that is very, very important. So the more a worker works, the more the worker denies himself and does not affirm himself. Why? Because the labor is not his, the labor does not belong to him. The worker only feels himself outside his work. So basically, and he in his work, he feels outside himself. So the worker only feels himself outside his work, and in his work, he feels outside himself. What does that mean? He is at home when he is not working, right? And when he is working, he is not at home. So basically, again, he is not really at peace with work. That's an important point. His labor is not voluntary. And because his labor is not voluntary, there's not much that he can do. His labor is not voluntary. It is forced labor. It's coerced labor, forced labor. So basically, people feel, Marx also points out, people feel freely active only in their animal functions: eating, drinking, procreating. So they feel human while performing functions that are basically animal functions. And in the essentially human process of labor, something that distinguishes them from animals, when they are performing that, they actually feel like animals. So this is where the important phrase, the much cited phrase comes. And this could be just a question, just the phrase: what is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal, right? So that is, and productive activity, productive capacity, productive activity in capitalism is reduced because it becomes such a boring and stultifying means to the fulfillment of the only end that really matters in capitalism. What is the only end? The end is earning enough money. And why do you earn enough money? Why do the capitalists try to earn enough money? To earn more money. So basically earning, so that's for the capitalist. But for the worker, the point is you only earn, the only objective, the only purpose is to earn enough to survive, right? So that's something. So productive activity ceases to be a satisfying act in itself. It becomes a very boring and stultifying thing. Then you have these 4 stages, and that is something that you're already aware of, so I will not go into the details. That Marx does not talk about alienation as an event. He talks about it as a process which has different stages. So you are sort of alienated from the process of production, alienated from the produce, alienate from the product, alienated from fellow workers, and alienated from your own self. Now there is, so this is something that Marx wrote about, and he also pointed out that alienation is only to be found in capitalism. He was absolutely clear that alienation was not there in feudalism, it wasn't there in slavery or ancient mode of production. So he was very clear about that. And he was also quite clear that the only way in which you can do something about it is by bringing about a total transformation, right? You just changing the entire thing. Means of production to be owned by everyone, relations of production to be completely changed, mode of production to be completely changed. Well, that's when alienation wouldn't be there. Now, there are some criticisms as well. For example, the first criticism, and this is something that George Ritzer helps us understand, that there is a criticism in terms of, if you're talking about criticisms, so in terms of the content, so the content of alienation basically. So what constitutes alienation? This is something that Marx does not really help us understand. What constitutes alienation? What are the true indicators of alienation, right? What exactly goes into it? It has been argued that it is difficult to identify the true contents or the actual content of alienation, and basically then it's very difficult to figure out whether existing work is rightly characterized as alienated, which is forced, frustrating, etc., etc., or whether, and once you get to know about the content, then perhaps you can always do something about how to turn it into a meaningful, unalienated work. So in terms of content, then in terms of extent, extent, so this is another thing, meaning the degree of alienation faced by people is highly contextual. First, certain systematic forms of alienation have, first of all, it is not universal, meaning not everyone really experiences alienation. So that is one. The other is alienation in various forms is experienced across cultures or across modes of living. So there are, for example, religious alienation in medieval world, for example, alienation that is faced by Dalits who were into menial jobs, or alienation faced by women, housewives, etc. So you have, it is extremely difficult to measure the extent onto which alienation exists. So, and basically where all exists, in what conditions, etc. This is also something that does not come out very clearly in the theory. Then there is also issue in terms of prognosis, meaning Marx was very clear in terms of his prediction that communist society, the classless society, will be free of systematic forms of alienation. For example, alienation at work. But he does not really help us understand what exactly will happen in a communist society as a result of which we will not have alienation. And for example, machinery is going to be there, production is going to be there. So in what ways now the machinery is going to be used so that it does not lead to alienation, right? So this is again, so there is no serious discussion about how precisely alienation will be reduced, if not completely removed. And then alienation, of course, can be due to other sources of exploitation or other sources of inequality, for example, gender, sexual orientation, disability, race, ethnicity, identities, etc. And lastly, of course, capitalism is one heck of an intelligent system. So it has been pointed out that not all jobs or not all work opportunities in capitalism are alienating. We have various cases wherein people actually enjoy, and they genuinely enjoy. It's not that they're pretending. They genuinely enjoy the stuff that they're doing. For example, creating video games, directing movies, doing stand-up, etc., etc. So there is freelancers, people working with civil society organizations, etc. So people just love their work. So this is also something that one needs to think about, whether it is all, whether the fact remains that alienation is something that characterizes all sectors of work, or it expresses itself differently in more nuanced ways. So that is also something that does not really come out very clearly in the whole discussion on alienation. Now, when it says similarities and differences between Marx's theory of alienation, now alienation is primarily to do with, now for Marx, alienation is more of a, it's a given, right? And for Durkheim, anomie is more of a situational thing. So anomie is something that, and we will discuss this when we do division of labor, but Durkheim, the anomie is not really normal. Anomie is a situation wherein division of labor is not really it's being carried out the right way. Whereas alienation, according to Marx, is actually an absolutely normal, routine thing vis-a-vis capitalist mode of production. So this is how. So of course, in this particular case, we first define alienation, what all constitutes alienation. Then we look at division of labor and how both division of labor and alienation essentially talk about a certain deviance, they talk about a certain pathology, and then what are the, so these are similarities, but in terms of differences, while division of labor is primarily to do with the social order particularly, alienation is primarily to do with work and labor, or labor capital associations, relations of production, etc. According to Marx, capitalism transforms. So this is again something, this is something to do with commodification, and I'll come to that in some time.